everyone, I'm Trevor Hanson, and welcome to Talking Transpo. Today's talk is about transportation data, specifically transportation data for planning in small and rural communities. Over the past number of years, I've had an opportunity to work in a number of small communities to try to help them understand their transportation challenges. And the first place we start is looking at the available data. And that means going to things like the census. But what we found in going through some of these exercises is that the data aren't necessarily there at the resolution that are needed to be able to organize something, like determine the number of vehicles that you need for a service, the number of trips per day that people are taking, and specifically where they're going. And I believe it's these limitations which are making it very challenging for some small and rural communities to meet their transportation needs. So today I'm going to take you through this research paper and talk to you about why I think there's an opportunity to build on national data sets like the census to get the data that smaller communities need in order to help inform their decision making. This is the paper I presented, and it has a very long title. Can we better leverage national data collection initiatives to support transportation planning in smaller cities and rural areas in Canada? A view from New Brunswick. The point being, why I have a big long title like this is to try to fit everything in, explain it all at once. But the main thing was that we have things like the census, which can be really useful for planning purposes. But as I'll take you through, there's some limitations to it for being able to use it for transportation. Let's just take this example here. This is showing that the population aged 65 years and older in Canada, this is back in 2011, and this is the forecast for the next 40 years. That up in Canada, that 25% of the population will be over the age of 65. So it kind of leads to this bigger problem. How do we respond to the transportation needs of an aging population? Well, in order to respond to it, we first need to understand it. How do we understand something? Well, you need to measure it. Well, how do we measure? And that's where this paper was going. That if we were to look at the three main data sources for support to understanding transportation, you'll often hear this in the news: journey to work data. How many New Brunswickers rely on their car to get to work? And that is a value you may hear quoted in the news. There are other national surveys out there that do include travel behavior. And the third main data source is through urban travel surveys. And that might be a survey that your city or region puts out. So here's the main journey to work table. So when you go to StatsCan and you go to their website, you can actually choose, here's Fredericton, my place of work, total commuting duration, and look, people who live in Fredericton, work in Fredericton, there's 37,500 people that live in Fredericton and work in Fredericton, according to, this is back in 2016 data. And 33,000 report going with the car, truck, or van, 26,000 driving alone. But there's two things to kind of note in here. The first is that this is the main mode of commuting. That's what I think is one of the first limitations of these data. So this is something that you do most often. So if I drive myself to work most of the time, or 60% of the time, and maybe 40% of the time, I take transit. That's not going to show up in these data. Another thing that is interesting here, if you look down in the bottom corner, there are 25 people who live in Toronto and work in Fredericton. Well, how do you, and their main mode of commuting is the car. How do we reconcile that? It's a pretty small number overall. This is where you work most often, and this is the transportation you use most often. So you're going to see some really strange things sometimes. It's not that people are living in Toronto and flying to Fredericton every day, or driving to Fredericton, but it may be when they're working in Fredericton most of the time. We probably all know a lot of people that who have commuted, who flew out west to work for a few weeks at a time, and then come back and go back and work. That's not, and when they're there, perhaps that they're going on a bus or they're driving, but they would be weighted exactly the same as someone who drives to work every day in Fredericton. Maybe some of you remember almost a decade ago now when we were talking about getting rid of the long form census, which contains a lot of information that we could use for planning. And this was what I thought was one of the impacts that when we went to the voluntary census, the result was, well, fewer people respond to it. And this, I think, had a big impact on rural areas. If we look at these communities in New Brunswick, ranged from almost 40% to 50% didn't respond to the long-form census in 2011. Compared that to the 2016 census, we went from 4% to 10%. So that means there's a really big chunk of the population, particularly in these smaller towns, that didn't provide information that would help us understand what was going on in the community. And the impact, if we think back to 2011, one of the things that was said about the National Household Survey, which was what was created to replace the long-form census, was that data from 3% of the Canadian population was not released. What that meant was that these response rates were decent enough in 97% of the Canadian population to release. But what I found by going through the data was that 11% of the New Brunswick data were not released, which meant we had fewer responses. So if we're planning on data that comes out of these surveys, well, there's less of it, and of what there was of it, we didn't respond as much. There are other national surveys. The U.S. data on household travel can be used, and has been used as a proxy for Canada, but we tend to have higher transit use here, so it's not 100% transferable, but it is a source of information if we don't have it. This is not something that's replicated in Canada. There are these other two surveys as well, but what I found by going through them, that each time that they redid the survey, there were fewer questions about transportation. And questions about transportation that were asked weren't about things that you could really help you operationally, like percentage of the time that you have someone taking you to healthcare. Do you have some of the time, most of the time, all the time? And if you think about breaking something up into a scale like that, that doesn't tell me or someone who's trying to plan transportation for healthcare of, well, how many vehicles do I need? How many people will be driving? How much a week would I be needing to provide transportation people who don't have any other option? So to me, that's the big limitation. It helps identify what the big problem is with respect to transportation and healthcare, but it doesn't allow you to figure out how much. We see some really large urban travel surveys like Toronto, Montreal, and Moncton, Greater Moncton have all done that, but that can be limited to city borders. So when we think about what this leads us for challenges, if we have this national data for journey to work as really the sole source of national data that helps us understand how people use transportation, well, just as an example, out of one research project I did, 6% of the people in my sample took work trips. 6% of the trips were work trips. So if journey to work, as an example, to help us understand how older adults use transportation, we're going to miss a good chunk of them because they're retired. Same issue with the national data sets. How are we going to operationalize most of the time, some of the time, all the time when it comes to measuring transportation? And what about our urban data that excludes small and rural areas? When I think about building tomorrow's society, which was the theme of the conference back in 2018, I point people to this document here. And I'm going to do a video on this too, take you through this document. But this was a transportation strategy prepared for the Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation of New Brunswick by a committee of folks, including myself. And if we look at the first reason why this strategy was prepared, it was that New Brunswick has largely achieved its previous vision for automobile-based mobility, but this mobility now makes populations dependent on the ability to own and drive a car. So, if in the next number of years, a quarter of the population of Canada is going to be over the age of 65, where the health effects of aging can make transportation difficult or impossible over time, yet our society is automobile-based, how are we going to address this? So when I think of opportunities, could we amend the census? I'm just a transportation person. I don't know how to go about amending the census. I've done surveys and I know it's a ton of work. But if we think of a national data effort that helps us understand, for example, how many people that live in Fredericton commute to Fredericton, could we add in questions about health? Going to health, transportation to health, transportation to shopping. That would give a lot of help to smaller communities that don't have the ability to collect these data on their own. Would it make sense for urban centers to expand their travel data collection outside of their boundaries? You have to put a scope on things. And one of the challenges with transportation planning tools is that they're urban focused, and the numbers can be so large they can overwhelm rural numbers. Big data. You can go on to Google Maps and you can see whether there's a traffic jam or not. And I think that's fascinating that in small towns and small cities that big data is giving us information about transportation that we wouldn't have any other way. So maybe there's an opportunity to use that. So I hope you found this an interesting presentation, give you some insight onto transportation data and what challenges and opportunities we have both in New Brunswick and Canada as a whole to helping answer questions about mobility, and in particular mobility for older adults. Thanks for listening.